about Mike Johnson. It was a long bit about Mike Johnson, but he's such a fuck up. So initially, he voted against the 9/11 first responders bill. So the first responders on 9/11, when the towers fell, for boys and girls who don't remember that, terrorists crashed commercial aircraft, like 747s into the Twin Towers in New York, and the buildings burned and collapsed, killed 3,000 people, something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of the first responders, the firefighters, the cops, the EMTs that were there, because they were inhaling all the jet fuel and the smoke and the rubble and all that, they had severe medical problems for the rest of their lives. And they're gonna. And so they passed a bill to make sure these people got funding, then the government would pay for their medical care. Because this happened in the line of duty, right? Trying to serve the city. Well, Jon Stewart of The Daily Show was a big proponent of this. Mike Johnson voted against this initially. Mm-hmm. And so this is Jon Stewart talking about it. And this was a famous clip from whatever it was, year 2019, I think it was, where they were talking about renewing this bill. But this got out of hand.
I want to thank Mr. Collins, Mr. Naylor for putting this together. But as I sit here today, I can't help but think what an incredible metaphor this room is for the entire process that getting health care and benefits for 9/11 first responders has come to. Behind me, a filled room of 9/11 first responders. And in front of me, a nearly empty Congress. Sick and dying, they brought themselves down here to speak to no one. It's shameful. It's an embarrassment to the country, and it is a stain on this institution. And you should be ashamed of yourselves for those that aren't here, but you won't be. Because accountability doesn't appear to be something that occurs in this chamber. We don't want to be here. Lou doesn't want to be here. None of these people want to be here. But they are, and they're not here for themselves. They're here to continue fighting for what's right. Lou's going to go back for his 69th chemo. The great Ray Pfeiffer would come down here, his body riddled with cancer and pain, where he couldn't walk. And the disrespect shown to him and to the other lobbyists on this bill is utterly unacceptable.
So you should watch the whole thing. He goes on for 10 minutes. But he's right. They just threw him under the bus, and it was the Republicans who voted against it. There weren't any Democrats who voted against this bill. It's a no-brainer kind of bill, right?
It's an absolute disgrace.
I know. But Mike Johnson was one of the guys that voted against it, right? And then he flipped because Jon Stewart did that. That went viral. It was a national news story, right? That whole speech by Jon Stewart. And then furthermore, one of the guys that he mentioned that was testifying with cancer testified later that day, died a few days later.
I remember that. Living in New York State, that's all been very big news.
Yeah.
I have friends that were just simply living in the city at the time that were not first responders that have medical issues that are ongoing ever since, just by their proximity to the site and, breathing in, the toxicity that was in the air and just all of it.
Yeah.
And to pull the funding that people need for themselves and their families when they were serving their city and their country at that in a national emergency is absolutely asinine.
No, it's totally crazy. Anyway, I want to play one more clip about that. So this was the local news channel in Louisiana where Mike Johnson's from. and they covered this story, but they're going to cut right to the chase.
Our top story this morning, the House Judiciary Committee is set to vote today on the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund. It was an emotional hearing. Jon Stewart and first responders called out politicians for not already providing full funding. I can't even believe we're talking about this, but the fund has paid out claims to 22,000 first responders. But according to the World Trade Center Health Program, there are roughly 95,000 who could be eligible. 4th District Congressman Mike Johnson sits on the committee people considering whether to renew the funding.
Mr. Johnson, you made a point earlier, and it was one that we have heard over and over again in these halls, and I couldn't help but to answer to it, which was, you said, look, you guys are obviously heroes, and 9/11 was a big deal, but, we have a lot of stuff here to do. And, we got to make sure there's money for a variety of disasters, hurricanes and tornadoes. But this wasn't a hurricane, and this wasn't a tornado. And by the way, that's your job anyway. We can't fund these programs. You can.
He's right.
Yeah, we spoke with Johnson. He tells us that the fund could be expanded to 2090 with no ceiling.
Sadly, we're about to cross the tragic landmark where we've lost more people from 9/11 than we lost on 9/11 because of the illnesses, cancers, and other maladies that have befallen the people who were there and helped. Jon Stewart was there, and he's been a very passionate advocate for the first responders. And as I told him after the hearing, and I said publicly during the hearing, I understand this myself. I've experienced it. My own father was a firefighter who was critically burned and permanently disabled in the line of duty.
Well, Johnson expects that bill to pass with huge.
Well, I want to talk about what a scumbag he is for 1 second here. So your father was a firefighter who was severely injured in the line of duty. And then a bunch of firefighters and cops and EMTs who were injured in the line of duty in a terrorist attack, and you initially vote it down? And I know a lot of you are going to sit there, well, how do you know that he voted it down? I'm like, first off, he voted it down. You can look it up initially. He did vote for it this time. They passed it through, whatever it is, 2092, I think. But you don't go up to Jon Stewart, who's leading the charge, and say, well, these guys are heroes, but we got other shit going on, if you've already voted for it or you're going to vote for it. What you tell him is, we're going to try and get this thing passed. You don't sit there and give him an excuse if you're already on his side.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't show up later and give this heartfelt story about, well, my dad was injured and blah, blah. So I understand. No, you fucking don't. Otherwise, you'd have done this in the first place. And these 70,000 people wouldn't have gone without health care that needed it when the first time this came around. So this is the new Speaker of the House. So when he sits there and says, we're not going to fund Israel or Ukraine, cut the IRS, he just doesn't give a shit. I mean, he really doesn't care. So we'll move on.